Hello, Lambertville. This is Mayor Julia Fahl and our business administrator, Alex Torpey. We want to welcome you to our budget presentation that will precede the governing body discussing and introducing our budget for 2020 and then its ultimate adoption. With that, I'm going to kick it over to Alex to explain what our plan is for our presentation today.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. So we are going to walk through a couple different important areas here regarding the budget. Hopefully some of you have tuned in or participated in some of the budget presentations that we did in 2019. And so we're going to run through that overview just really quick in the beginning. And this document, the presentation that we're walking through here, and the spreadsheet that we look at later are going to be available online for you to kind of go through at your leisure also. So we are trying to keep this relatively short, although we know that's kind of a difficult bar. We've got a lot of information to go through. But if there's anything that you want to come back to, again, you'll be able to find that documentation online. So we're going to talk a little bit about our kind of highest financial priority, the structural deficit or imbalance, a little bit what that is, how it impacts taxes in Lambertville, not just this year, but for the next 6 years, and sort of the options that are available to fix that. Some of this we've covered before. We're going to talk a little bit about the goals for the 2020 budget, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of pre-COVID budget that the mayor and I were getting pretty close to kind of getting ready for when we all got hit with all of this. And then a little bit of a discussion of the financial impact of COVID-19 on the city's finances, and then some steps going forward about where we go from here. So I'm going to breeze through these slides because these are ones we've covered in great detail in 2019. But if you do want to check these out, they are valuable to take a look through because they do set up some of the really important pieces about why the mayor created the business administrator position, why we're creating the new budget process. All of these things are all kind of pieces of a bigger puzzle. So again, you can find all of that online.
So I want to stop here to just say that the most important goal of the work that Alex, myself, and our city council is trying to do is to address the city's significant financial challenges and ultimately to reduce short and long-term tax impact. Over the course of 2019, we did a lot of study into what the challenges and opportunities were from our previous financial situation and inappropriate budgeting practices that the city has partaken in over the last 10 years and the financial situation we're in now. And what we are working to do in this 2020 budget and for the next 5 years is to look forward and try and reduce total tax impact.
Great, and that's an important goal to keep in mind as we go forward with all of the conversation here. As the mayor said, everything that we're doing is framed in those goals. The next piece is a timeline. We're a little bit behind right now, about a month behind because of COVID-19, but all the steps are here. So if you want to go through those again in more detail, you can do so. A couple things that are important going forward. It is helpful if you have looked at our previous budget presentations. So some of the terminology, some of the background information, all of that is available online, lambertvillenj.org/2020 budget. It's also important to remember that there are a bunch of estimates and anticipations and forecasts in here. Although we did, and this our finance team, mayor, myself, our clerk's office and deputy treasurer, our chief financial officer, financial advisors, bond attorney, all of us are part of this process together. But there are estimates in here, especially when we start looking multiple years out. So it's just worth keeping that in mind. And we've made everything the accurate as we can. There is kind of this two-step part of the budget. There's kind of pre-COVID and then kind of a post-COVID, just so everybody can see. It's important to flesh out some of the details of what this budget was going to be before all this happened and then kind of what it is after. And so why don't we head right into some of the problem statements. Some of these are going to look familiar from our August presentation from 2019. So there are kind of 6 main problem statements. 5 of them kind of add up to the last one to some degree. So the first one is the process for generating a surplus or fund balance. This is the city's savings. The second one is the total amount of debt the city has accrued. The third is the process for funding the payments for that debt, and the lack of capital planning and budgets for capital projects. The fourth is the lack of certain required items in the operating budget, which we'll come back to. All of these we'll come back to a little bit. The fifth is not keeping up with inflation and other rising costs. All of these things sort of add up together to a structural deficit or a structural imbalance. Addressing the existence of this imbalance is the highest priority. Not only does it directly address the future tax impacts, but it's also a sort of helpful way to measure whether the core underlying issues of the city's finances and budget were actually resolved. A structural imbalance or deficit is only existing in a situation where something else has gone wrong. It's a symptom of other problems. And so it can be a good measure to understand if you've addressed those problems.
And ultimately, as we stated at the beginning of this presentation, we are looking to address long-term and short-term tax impacts while also leaving Lambertville in a financially more sound position than we found it in 2019.
Absolutely. So let's do a real quick refresher on a structural deficit. This is basically when there is less money in a budget than there are expenses. And structural means that it is built to repeat every year. It's not a one-time event. This can also be referred to as a structural imbalance. Those are relatively kind of interchangeable terms. This exists if expenses rise or revenues go down without filling in the money to make up the difference. In Lambertville specifically, our structural deficit exists primarily from many years of capital spending far beyond what the city's tax base could support. So we have unbudgeted expenses, such as debt service, that we must pay. We're contractually obligated to make those payments the same way you would be when you take out a mortgage on a house. But where does the money come from? And if we don't make major changes to the way the city's finances and budget works right now, that burden will fall entirely on the backs of existing taxpayers.
And it's important to note here that the city of Lambertville's government, but really no government, works in a month-to-month or a week-by-week fashion. Governments work in year-over-year planning. And so if we want to address this structural deficit, we have to think long-term, which is why we created this new budget process and why we start to think about Lambertville's future in a 6-year timeline.
Absolutely. So let's take a quick look at some of the things that would have happened if we weren't making some of the changes in the budget. There's three of the most important points. This doesn't cover everything that would have happened, but these are the three kind of highest priority pieces here. The first is the tax impact. If we made no changes over the next 6 years, the average assessed home would have seen approximately $1,000 of increases from debt service alone, closer to $3,000 of increases of spending at pre-2019 levels continued. That means that 6 years from now, in 2025, your taxes would have been, if spending at prior levels had continued, would have been approximately $3,000 more than they are today.
And of that $3,000, 1,000 of those dollars would have been just for debt service because of the inappropriate spending levels that we've been using in the city of Lambertville for the last 13 years.
That's right. And the other two pieces here are sort of similar. They're both numbers that make up sort of this quote unquote surplus number. The first is a reserve for debt service levels. So this is an account that we've talked about before where unspent capital funds were deposited in this account, and then money was pulled out of that account to pay the deficit that was caused by the borrowing. So that reserve for debt service account will be entirely depleted after the 2021 budget. And for the first time in many years, the entire burden of paying the city's debt will be unbudgeted. The last piece is the surplus levels. If we made no changes to the current trajectory, the city's surplus would fall below the best practice threshold, which is about $500,000 for a municipality our size in 2021, and it would have been entirely depleted by 2023, which is an impossible situation to be in which we'll cover in a little bit more detail as we go. So we're going to spend a minute on each of these three things right now. So the first is the tax impact. So as we mentioned, if spending continued at the pre-2019 levels, which is approximately an average of about $1.5 million of capital spending per year, the average assessed homes taxes in 2025 would have been $3,000 more than they are today. And as the mayor mentioned, $1,000 of that would have been just from the rise in debt service costs alone. And remember, that wouldn't include other increases such as the fire district, school, or county. That's just on the municipal portion.
And this is an untenable tax increase over the next 5 years. The city of Lambertville is already overburdened by property taxes. And so if the city does not address this property tax increase specifically over the next 5 years, Lambertville would be unaffordable to a lot of folks that have called this home for generations.
And I think all of us, it's easy to say, we see that as a worst case scenario. That is a, yeah.
And that's why we're taking drastic measures to first educate the public about these significant issues and then starting to address them, which we'll do later in this presentation.
So let's run on to the next one. So this is the depletion of the reserve for debt service. So there's a couple different lines here. And again, you can go back to this presentation in a PDF format if you want to spend a little more time looking at these numbers. So the blue line is really the most important. That is the available balance in the reserve for debt service account. You can see that starting in 2015, this number has been going down. The yellow or orange line is the total amount of debt service the city is paying. And the red line is the amount of reserve for debt service that's utilized in the budget. And again, that was typically done to cover the difference between what was budgeted to pay debt service and what was owed to pay debt service. And again, that blue line is showing that that account is on its way very shortly to be entirely depleted. The next important account to look at is the depletion of the city's fund balance or surplus account. And so the blue line, again, is the available balance in that account. And again, you can see that this account has been going in a downward trajectory for some time, even though the levels that have been utilized have actually remained relatively stable, especially as we try to predict out the future. And so that is a real problem. If your levels are even anywhere in the same territory of how much you're utilizing in your budget every year, and it's going down, that means that there is a structural imbalance that has to be solved. So that sort of lays out the problem. This might be for those of you who've tuned into the budget presentations 2019, this is going to look familiar. We're going to run through each of these options of what can be done to fix a structural deficit. And so the first option is continue to borrow.
So I want to stop here to say that continuing to borrow is not a responsible choice. It is the easier choice for a municipality. Politically, it's the easiest choice because it's an option that obfuscates the total cost of what it costs to run a city, and it also pushes off the actual tax burden, so it's not felt year over year. But it is also the most expensive way to do business, and so we want to wean the city of Lambertville off of this irresponsible budgeting practice and start to get back to a place where we are borrowing responsibly.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the second option, which is to cut costs and services. And cutting costs is obviously a high priority, but there are a couple challenges. The first is that the city's historically underfunded many of the city's budget lines, so there really isn't that much left to cut. And because there's so little left, any tangible cuts that would make a difference in the context of the financial problems the gap that we need to close here, the level of cuts that would be required to fill this year's deficit would be well beyond the savings of eliminating all full-time city staff and their salaries and benefits, all of them, which is obviously not possible.
And it's important to note here that it may feel like the right thing to do to tighten our belts and shave off the sides, but this is such a significant structural financial problem that just cutting around the edges will never actually address the significant structural concerns that we were presented in 2019.
And even though there's not a ton to cut in operating, although we have made some, there is some to cut on the capital side. And so that is and you've heard us talk about this over and over again, right, is making sure that kind of everybody is aware of where the highest priority areas are that are the cost drivers. We need to kind of triage what's out there. And so there are a couple things that we have already done to try to stop the hemorrhaging here and get us into a better place to figure out where we need to go for the next 6 years. So in 2019, for example, we reduced the amount of new debt authorized by 97% over prior years. In addition, we've been looking a lot at, we've talked a lot about the cost of professional services and how much the city relies on outside consultants to do some of the work. Now, we've got outside consultants and contracted professionals who do really phenomenal work and provide really tremendous value to the city, but it is not a blanket, it works or it doesn't work. We have to look on a case-by-case, project-by-project basis to understand if any particular arrangement is actually in the best financial interest of the city. And so there were a couple projects recently that we were able to really pull a lot of money out of. So Clinton Phase 2, for example, the final cost of that project came in over $300,000 less than the original budget. And that netted an actual savings of somewhere around $120,000 based on how much was left in that bond ordinance when we actually went to pay everything out. George Street, the project that we are about to start shortly, phases 1 and 2, is right now it looks like it's going to come in a little bit over $200,000 under the original budget. We've also been applying for a number of grants, trying to bring in some additional revenue through that standpoint. And we've been really aggressively pursuing shared services with some of our neighbors, with the county, and through some grant applications to the Department of Community Affairs to try to get some money to help us study some regional service providing that we could be doing in Hunterdon County. And then on the operations standpoint, we're also looking at finding efficiencies such as replacing energy inefficient light fixtures or other things like that not only have a beneficial environmental impact but save a little bit of money, switching to a new phone system that saves some money, and things like that. But again, those won't solve the problem.
But it is important to note here that none of those, either the reduction in capital spending, the savings from better oversight from professional fees, would have been possible without us professionalizing our administrative staff and hiring a business administrator. So we can move on to the next, but it is important to note your work in accomplishing those types of savings.
I appreciate that. And if folks want to go back and look at some of that, we do have all of the kind of readout from all of our departments from the budget presentations from 2019. So the next, we're not going to go through all of these again, because we provided this detail, really a lot of detail in last year's presentations. But if you wanted to check, this is the kind of detail of the most important cost drivers for the city. Next, moving on to the third out of the 4 options, which is increasing taxes. And Mayor, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. We understand that some tax increase will be inevitable in order to solve the structural issues that we were given in 2019. But we can't solve it on taxes alone. It is important to note that myself and the council see it as our highest priority to maintain Lambertville's affordability. And so, Alex, if you want to go into some of the details of why putting this all on taxpayers would be an inappropriate and irresponsible next step.
Yeah, I mean, we can just think about it in broad strokes. I mean, imagine, we've talked about everybody knows how high taxes are in New Jersey already. And as the mayor said, there's going to have to be some small increases going forward to start to keep up with the times, basically. And to make up for some of the past. But generally speaking, none of us see this as a potential practical option here. to make Lambertville that unaffordable for so many people who have lived here for decades or for generations.
And so this slide in particular was what drove us to start to think really critically about how we can avoid having the taxpayers shoulder this specifically. So I think that leads us to the next slide.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue into really what the most practical and impactful, and by far the most impactful possible kind of solution here is, which is to find new revenue or add ratables by bringing in people into our tax base who aren't paying into it currently.
And so what that means is that the city of Lambertville wants to widen and broaden its tax base by doing things like building new buildings, selling current city facilities, trying to find different and creative ways to bring revenue in so that all of that burden doesn't fall on taxpayers.
And we know that, you know, in any sort of like group payment plan, like an insurance policy or program, adding more people into it only helps reduce the burden on everybody. This is the same kind of thing. And so part of the problems, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later too, in the kind of vulnerability of Lambertville during COVID-19 from a finance perspective is that, you know, there's really two different groups of places that we raise revenue from. One is tax revenue and one is non-tax revenue. Many towns have both, and it's a different mix in different places. But part of the problem in Lambertville is only 47% of our budget is from tax revenue. The rest comes from fines and fees and other sources that fluctuate on a regular basis, and which we will get to later, are significantly in decline, for example, on this year. So just below is an example of a couple other municipalities that are somewhat similar and the percent of revenue they get from taxes. So you can see that on this list, Lambertville is the second lowest, and most of them are much higher in the 60s or 70%, which allows for more consistent budgeting on a year-to-year basis and less pressure on the departments who raise revenue to even be thinking about revenue as part of their jobs. And what's important to note is that in thinking through what this means, finding new revenue sources or new ratable sources, every new dollar paid into the city, whether this is a tax payment itself or it's a payment in lieu of taxes or any other revenue source, any dollar from that offsets a dollar that existing taxpayers would have to pay to help pay for the increases. So it doesn't matter really what source that dollar comes from. Again, whether it's a tax payment, whether it is a payment in lieu of taxes or some other revenue source, that new dollar offsets an existing dollar. And so when thinking through, like, for example, what the mayor mentioned, you know, some of the proposed plans that the city has discussed is the public property being sold potentially for redevelopment. Not only does it create one-time revenue for the sale of the property, but it also creates annual revenue, whether it is tax revenue or pilot revenue. Both of those are exactly the same. If they're the same dollar amount, it's exactly the same as to how much it would offset. And we don't want to go down and get too far into pilots during this presentation, but it's an important piece to clear up. That
and you can look forward to that at our next
that's right.
one of our next videos.
That's right. The important takeaway here is that any new revenue source helps offset the burden on existing taxpayers. So there's really a key takeaway here going into our budget for this year.
Yeah, and so
ahead.
if we don't implement new budgeting practices and start thinking long term in order to reduce total tax impact over the next 5 years, Lambertville residents who live here now could be hit with huge tax increases. And so, as well as putting us in a dire financial situation where we've depleted our surplus and our reserves for debt service, we have to start thinking about what Lambertville is going to look like, not only in our budget year 2020, but in 2021 through 2025, so that we can reduce the extreme financial risks that we're in now because of inappropriate and irresponsible budgeting practices over the last 10 years.
So there's a couple important points to flesh out there that got built into the budget for this year. The first is to stop the prior trends that were depleting the city's savings and ensure that our fund balance level and our surplus stays as far above $500,000 cash on hand as possible. Two is to limit new capital spending to only the most critical items, at least for the next several years. Three, to make decisions in 2020 and for 2020 as part of a newly created strategic and capital plan that takes into account how our present actions impacts future taxes. Four, to minimize and stabilize but not completely eliminate the tax impact from prior borrowing and debt service obligations. Five, to anticipate future ratables and more cost-effective facility maintenance plans. And six, to anticipate increases in operating for every future year to begin raising staff salaries, providing full health benefits, improving trash and recycling pickup, improving the condition and quality of city facilities and availability of public space, providing more support to the downtown and business community, providing more support for the arts and culture in Lambertville, and initiating more local shared services.
And what that means to us is that even while we are trying to address a significant and extreme financial hardship that our city has been in for the last several years, we also think that we can continue to provide better government and provide better services for our city.
That's right. Okay, so basically, those are the goals that went in here, and that leaves us here for 2020. So going into 2020, we faced an imbalance or a deficit of almost $600,000. That means that there were $600,000 of expenses that were not in the budget. That would have meant approximately $300 per homeowner tax increase as a starting point before new programs, new capital spending, or the impact of COVID-19. Obviously,
and
that.
So,
Okay.
what the city has done, and with the work of our financial team, is to try and reduce that tax impact this year, so that we were not presenting the city with a $300 tax increase.
And so we've got a couple different ways that we looked at trying to mitigate that. So the first, as the mayor mentioned before, is by creating the business administrator position to manage the finance and administration of the city, to help design a new budget process, provide financial oversight on a day-to-day basis, and lay out a multi-year plan. That was one of the kind of important first steps here to try to correct where the city's finances were heading. We also are creating the city's first comprehensive strategic plan so that we are not making decisions that are siloed within the same year that the budget is being voted on. And we have some idea of what that impact will be in future years. As we mentioned, we cut some professional service spending pretty significantly, and very significantly by about 97%, reduced the amount of new debt that was authorized in 2019. We've been trying to find new revenue sources as well, in addition to reorganizing and reallocating funds across a whole bunch of operating and capital accounts so that the budget is actually more transparent, not just for us on the inside so that we can do better accounting and forecasting, but so the public can follow along year to year in a clearer way too, and understand where we're going and where we've been. And then the last piece was plans were proposed to create new ratables and return some public property to the tax rolls, as well as produce one-time revenue from the sale of a public facility before the 2022 budget cycle, which we call a critical cycle because that is the year that the reserve for debt service will not exist to help pay the city's debt service obligations, and where we have to start bringing down the amount of surplus we use to keep it at that 500,000 level.
So all these strategies are important, but they are only the first step in what the city needs to do in order to stop the hemorrhaging from decades of irresponsible budgeting practices. It is going to take several years for us to be able to totally address what the financial crisis that the city of Lambertville is in, which is why we're bringing up the critical budget year of 2022. And we'll be hearing us talk a lot more about that over the next year.
So what's important to take a kind of brief overview of at this point is what was ultimately included in this budget. And so there are, the first is what is not included, which is we are not authorizing new debt to pay existing debt. This does include some of the operating and capital cost cutting measures we've discussed. This does start to reverse the trend of our surplus being depleted. And it spreads the reserve for debt service funds up until 2022 instead of running out entirely before 2021. This also provides full staff health benefits for prescription and dental, and some key small raises for some staff that have been particularly left behind as far as how competitive their wages are. This does include the most critical capital spending. It does not include high, medium, or low priority capital spending. This does include all annual anticipated operating expenses. So this is just something the mayor and I have talked about before. There's been a lot of charges that have not been included in the budget even though we know they exist. And this also includes some assumptions that we've discussed for the future need of bringing more revenue in. Now, what we want to do is take you a quick walkthrough about how we came to some of these numbers. And Mayor, it's going to take me 1 second to just get this other spreadsheet up here. If there's anything on this slide that you wanted to reflect on.
I do want to say here, while Alex is fiddling with the technology, that the most important, as we start to talk about and pass bonds in this budget year, is that most of the bonds that we will issue and pass in 2020 are specifically related to potential revenue in the long term. So preparing city facilities and other studies to try and generate new revenue in the long term, we would consider that critical capital funding because it speaks to our longer term goal of reducing taxes overall, rather than in previous years where the former administration would bond for more capital than we could afford and use that excess capital to pay down debt costs. That's an inappropriate way of using capital rather than trying to do long-term strategic planning with our capital, which is what we are going to accomplish this year. Okay, let's walk through the spreadsheet.
Great, appreciate that. Okay, so what this is here, I'm going to make this a little bit easier to see, is I just want to walk you through a little bit of the calculations that we have done on our end. And so the first kind of goal to start with is making sure that we keep our fund balance and surplus levels at something healthy that does not cause us to get potentially a credit downgrade, which would make borrowing in the future more expensive, or that we'd have so little cash on hand that we would really be risking kind of our financial future. So this first section here is just setting up what the surplus levels are, how much is utilized in the budget every year, and then the shortfall of how much is utilized in this particular year versus how much was utilized in a prior year. And so we used 445,000 last year. We're bringing that down to 400,000 this year, and then you see down to 225,000 in the next year. So this year there is a $45,000 shortfall, which we will make up, and we'll tell you how we're doing that in a second. And then what I did, just so we can kind of see the calculations as we go, is the tax impact, the estimated tax impact of a change on the average assessed home. So the next piece is the debt service obligations. So this column here is the total amount of debt service that the city has to pay. This is existing debt service, not new debt service. This is everything that's already been borrowed. This is the impact on the average assessed home. This is how much is budgeted in the budget currently. So you can see pretty easy here, right? Clicking from here to here, that will get you the amount that is unbudgeted that we have to make up each year. We are expecting to increase that amount by 2% every year so that we can build that account so that we have a cushion there that we currently don't have, right? We have to make up this money from somewhere else.
And so what Alex means when he says that is that between 2020 and 2025, the largest part of our structural deficit is the unbudgeted amounts that we have in debt service. And this is a clear stated goal that we are going to build up that account to address that structural deficit and fix it by 2025.
Right.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And what you can see in that last column here again is just the impact per homeowner of just the unbudgeted portion, not the total debt service. Next is the reserve for debt service levels and how much that is utilized. Yeah.
And I just want to say really quickly here that it's important for everyone to remember that the reserve for debt service is an unusual account for municipal governments. This is not something that most municipalities do because it is an irresponsible budgeting practice. And that is the practice of borrowing more than you need and then taking that excess money and putting it into what we're calling a reserve for debt service to pay down the cost of borrowing more than you need. It's like taking out a credit card to pay off your other credit card bill. It's wildly expensive, and it is one of the reasons we have such a huge structural deficit that's based entirely or mostly around capital spending and borrowing.
It's been the biggest cost driver building this debt obligation over many years, and we are about to run out of this account. And so you can see the reserve for debt service levels. This is what we're coming into in 2020. This is how much we're utilizing. So this includes $45,000 additional because we need to bring the fund balance level down to a more manageable number. What this basically does is we have created a plan here that allows us to use a relatively similar amount to get us through the next 2 years. And now you might also it might be a little clearer to see, right, when you start seeing the zeros down here about why the 2022 budget cycle is so critically important. Because this help here, that doesn't exist anymore after starting in 2022. Next is moving on to an estimate on the average amount of appropriation increases that we would be making in the budget every year. This includes 2% cost of living wages for staff. This includes making sure that everything that we actually buy on a yearly basis is in the budget. This includes moving some of the charges for professionals that have only been charged to capital accounts because there was no operating account to pay them out of, even if the work wasn't on a capital project, right? We're creating those operating accounts, which we really need to do to be fully in compliance with the guidelines that the state has about how we budget.
And this is important to note because it solves the other problem that was created by the reserve for debt service and the way we were previously funding our budgets. This makes the actual true cost of government transparent rather than hiding operating costs in capital, which is also more expensive because you pay interest on that money.
It's a really important point that this is basically moving money from places where it was borrowed to being visible in every year's budget. That is a big portion of this. And we're going to have to do a little bit of that every year. Next, if we add any new capital spending, this is just the most critical projects at $150,000 a year. So remember that the prior spending, if you averaged out the last couple of years of capital spending, it came out to about $1.5 million a year. So we are proposing $150,000 a year, a pretty significant decrease for at least the next few years, maybe up until 2025, so that we can get a handle on our debt. Now, this would be, over the next 6 years, the approximate cumulative total without the police site redevelopment plan. This would be the average impact on a household. So if your taxes were $10,000 now, then in 2025, it would be $11,922. What's important to note here, and there's really no way to display this the right way on one of these spreadsheets, is you see this fluctuate a lot on a year-to-year basis. These are kind of the raw numbers. Most likely what would happen is you wouldn't see big ups and downs, which you'll see more of that we get into in a second. it would be smoothed out over the years. So if there was no increase in one year, that money would be banked to help keep the increase in the next year down. So I just want to make sure it's clear. I know it's kind of a wonky point, but it's important. This is why we put the cumulative number here, because each year is not exactly accurate, but the cumulative amount for all of those years is pretty accurate. So we want to look at the police site redevelopment, and we have a couple assumptions here that we'll share with you. So you can see there's a couple different pieces of revenue that are put in here. You can see first, if you want to, this is the estimated 6-year impact after doing the police site redevelopment. So that's about a $600 savings per average assessed home by doing this project. And that
I do want to sort of zoom out here really quickly and say this is only the tax impact for the city of Lambertville. It doesn't include tax impact from other taxable organizations like the firehouse, the county, or the state.
That's right. That's right. And so there are three assumptions really that are important to take into account here about how we came up with those numbers. The first is the one-time revenue from the sale of the police department lot to be able to do redevelopment on it. This $750,000 number is probably low. It is a very preliminary number. This is not a number that we have at this point yet brought in and paid a professional to perform a assessment and estimation, but based on similar sized properties with similar sized developments with similar number of units to the range that we proposed in Hunterdon County, that is a number that we're relatively comfortable with. And you'll see that throughout this, all of the revenue numbers we estimate low and all the expense numbers we estimate high, just to make sure that we are building ourselves a little bit of a cushion. The next piece is the recurring revenue. So what this is expecting is that halfway through 2022, this project would begin to come online and would begin paying into the city's revenue stream, whether as the tax base or as a pilot revenue, and $150,000 per year ongoing after that. The other assumption is basically these 2 years of $24,000 of temporary relocation for the police department. These are also preliminary estimates, and we believe that they're in the right range because there's also going to be a considerable savings by not paying the utilities and the other expenses related to the police being in their building. So it's not like there aren't some savings by moving out during the temporary period.
But it's important to note here that all of these are general assumptions to give the city of Lambertville and the public an idea of how we're starting to think through tax impact for this particular redevelopment project.
That's right, right. So that is sort of the basic idea of how that project would impact taxes. Now we're going to move on to a couple different scenarios here so that we can show folks a little bit of where our heads are at when we've used some of the numbers that we talk about regarding some of the police site redevelopment plans and also the city's potential community development plan. So there's and municipal consolidation plans. There's several different scenarios, not all of which are municipal consolidation, that we'll walk you through really quick. So the first one here is this is performing a full renovation of all of these city facilities as they stand currently. This is subtracting $1.5 million out of the total $9 million cost here, right? And so that $9 million is, we are making a few assumptions that we're paying 3% interest over a 15-year period of time. So we subtracted $1.5 million out of the police because we wouldn't own that building anymore. But this does not include the cost of relocating the police permanently. So that is an additional cost here that is worth keeping in mind. It's such a wide range at this point. This, again, is assuming the city does not move. The scenario one is not moving forward with the consolidation of facilities. If we do the police site redevelopment and we don't do a consolidation, right, we have to find a home for the police department. That could range between hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars. And so it's just important to note that this number would actually be higher, again, trying to be careful with our estimates. So moving on, moving on to the bare bones renovations. This was something that we had provided as, well, if we don't try to renovate the buildings to get the most that we can possibly get out of them, but we did it in a way that allows us to meet some of our baseline goals, what does that cost? We subtracted a little bit of cost out from the police side. So it's about $4 million at 3% over 15 years. And again, this scenario also doesn't take into account the permanent cost of the police home. That would be somewhere between several $100,000 and several $1 million. So this number would actually be higher than it is with those expenses in there. The next is we have two different consolidation scenarios. The first is a $10 million either new construction or rehab, right? This doesn't assume one way or another, but it does assume consolidating all of the municipal buildings into one. It assumes there are several different assumptions here that help come out to these numbers. So one is the sale of City Hall. The next is the sale of the library. And the next is turning the Acme site into some sort of program such as the state's Blue Acres programs. The assumptions that we use for each of those is $750,000 for the value of City Hall, $500,000 for the Lilly Mansion, and $750,000 for the Justice Center. We do believe that all of those are relatively low, especially the City Hall sale price. I think that that is potentially something that could be worth a lot more than that.
But it's important to note here that because we're so early on in this process, we haven't done some of the due diligence on inspecting and assessing those properties.
Right. So those are the three one-time revenue assumptions. On the recurring side, right, there are three assumptions. One is the Acme site will generate no tax revenue, and that the Lilly Mansion and City Hall would each generate about $25,000 a year in tax revenue, which again is probably low, but we decided to use a number that is, again, conservative. And just based on the one-time sale and that recurring revenue, you can see how big of a difference that makes in the overall cumulative impact over the next 6 years. If the city were to go a step further and do a consolidation of some sort that was an even more budget-constrained consolidation with $6 million facility, with a $6 million cost to the new facility. And remember, this isn't the sticker. This $6 million, 3% over 15 years, is the cost of the new facility. And then we take into account all of the other revenue pieces. And this does not take into account any potential grants that we're looking at. Again, want to estimate low on the revenue side so we don't overestimate our projections here. So again, scenario 4, consolidated facility, but instead of spending $10 million, $6 million is spent at 3% for 15 years. Same cost of, same revenue from selling the facilities and same revenue from ongoing taxes from those facilities. And you can see how significant that reduction could be in broad strokes over the next 6 years.
So, Alex, I just want to take us back out to the to our budget presentation and to talk a little bit about why we're talking to you about each of these potential scenarios and sort of what's next for the city. We are still in the early stages of making these discussions, but if you feel the city feeling urgently that we need to move forward on the discussion of each of these potential scenarios and start to make decisions, it is because in 2022, we have a significant tax impact from money that was borrowed over the last 13 years and the structural deficit that is pushing this pressure on top of us. And so we are coming up with scenarios to try and reduce the total tax impact of that inappropriate budgeting practices by finding creative ways to find revenue and by sort of showing our math on which of these seems like the next best step to reduce total tax impact in the city. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And we have a summary slide that is on the next page that I do notice that before we post the PDF, there's one or two errors in there that are small, but we'll correct before we post. And if you want to look at kind of all those options, we're also going to provide you with that spreadsheet we just walked through. And so if you want to look at those, a little bit more on your own time, you can certainly do so. So we're going to move on to the financial impact of COVID-19. And we covered this the other night in the city council meeting. Too much revenue comes from non-tax sources, which is inherently unreliable and variable. Too much of that non-tax revenue is especially variable. This includes court revenue, parking meters, and construction and fire fees. Number three, the city's surplus has been depleting for most of the last decade and is already dangerously low, which means we don't really have a savings account that we can dip into to help cover any problems in any particular year. And number four is that almost a quarter of the entire budget is one fixed cost that we have no control over, which is debt service.
So it's just important to keep in mind that even when we're talking about the long-term impact of bad budgeting practices for the next 5 years, those have other knock-on effects, like making the city of Lambertville extremely vulnerable to, unforeseen crises like COVID-19.
Right. I mean, the way our budget is set up is that if there's bad weather and we have less people visiting town and paying parking meters, that is an actual impact to our budget, which is a real problem.
Correct.
So we've got four different things here about how COVID-19 has impacted the city's finances. One is a massive revenue shortfall. Two is a potential slight reduction in anticipated collection rate for property tax payments. Three is some new expenses. And four is the use of staff time and overtime. The revenue shortfall is really significant. And we're going to get into that. We're going to give you all the numbers in a second. So we'll just sort of run past these because we're going to get right into the summary. Same for the reduction in anticipated tax collection rate. Some new expenses that we'll talk about in a second, and the usage of staff time and overtime, which is important to spend one moment on, which is that myself and most of our staff and our elected officials, everybody, has been spending the majority of their time doing things that are related to a COVID-19 response. That straight time, the salary time that we get, most of that is not going to be reimbursable at any level of government. It's just sort of the city taxpayers are expected to pick up that tab based on the state and federal frameworks for this. That is one piece which is worth being aware of, just how much staff time has been spent on this response. The next piece is that there is some overtime costs related to our response as well. So even though we can't predict with total accuracy, and we've certainly tried, I've met with other administrators from other towns, we've talked to folks from the state, we've done webinars from different professional associations. We're all trying to figure out how to do this the right way. There is no perfect way to do it. So what we have gotten is kind of our best guess, an estimate by going through with all of our department heads who are responsible for these different areas. So getting into the numbers, how much we're talking about. The revenue shortfalls, each of these numbers is the expected shortfall of what we were anticipating and now what we are anticipating post-COVID-19. So about $58,000 shortfall for court, a little over $200,000 for parking meters, a little over $200,000 for construction, $15,000 for fees and permits. We actually don't think that our fire prevention is going to be hugely impacted here. And a reduction of about $60,000 in hotel and motel fees. So that is a total of a $400,000 shortfall on the revenue side.
And it's important to note here that, to go back to our initial point, that the revenue portion of our budget is the vast majority of our budget, which is why this is so significantly impacted. Right. Whereas shortfalls from expenses is going to be much less.
And if our revenue only made up 10% of our non-tax revenue only made up 10% of our budget, it would be we'd be having a much different conversation. The expenses are listed out here. So we have some expenses related to communications and meetings, for cleaning services, for cleaning supplies and equipment, for overtime, which is mostly for the police, to enforce some of the governor's executive orders, and then some other small expenses that add up to about $35,000. So now we're going to get into some of the kind of total numbers here. So this is pre-COVID, a pre-COVID overview. So the amount to be raised, the increase in the amount to be raised by taxes, $286,000. Because the debt service is such a big part of this, we wanted to call out that number, that out of that $711 per household is the debt service obligation that we have to pay. The unbudgeted amount of that is $255 minus $196, which is the reserve for debt service account that's being applied for this. Comes out that the net amount that each average assessed home has to pay for increase in debt service payments is $59, and the net amount that each average assessed home would have to pay outside of debt service for increases is about $82, which takes you to $141.59.
And it's important to note here that those are the increases that we're expecting this year. Your tax bill already has 24% of your tax bill is already going to debt service payments. That $59 is extra on top of that.
That's right. This is just the increases. If we move on to sort of the the post-COVID overview, so the amount per average assessed home prior was $141.59. The revenue shortfall is about $196. The appropriation increase is about $17. So the total COVID-19 budget impact that we are anticipating is $213 per average assessed home. So if we add that number to the pre-COVID amount of $141, that gets us to $354.59.
So I want to stop here before we move on. We started this presentation by saying through our whole budget process over the last year, we realized that there was going to be about a $300 tax increase. And through the work of our finance team, we were able to reduce that to $141 pre-COVID, which we felt was a more reasonable total tax impact for the year 2020. Then 7 weeks ago, we realized that there was going to be significant shortfalls, and we've addressed those shortfalls to decide what the total budget impact from COVID would be, which is about $213. We then went to the council on April 23rd and had this conversation with the public that said, we don't want to make the city of Lambertville an unaffordable place to live, and we don't want the city to bear the burden of COVID-19 shortfalls because of our vulnerability entirely on this year. So we had a long discussion with the council about what our options were. So there were a number of strategies that we could have used to minimize this impact as much as possible. We've also been working with the state and federal government to advocate directly for changes to local aid, changes to the CARES Act, which would allow for smaller municipalities to take part in some of the funding opportunities the federal government is trying to provide. But either way, there will be tax impact from COVID. And so we had the conversation with city council. There is no best option here. And unfortunately, from the way that the conversations have been going at both the state and federal level, most of the help is going to pass over Lambertville and small town America in favor of bailing out larger cities. So do you want to go over the options, Alex?
Yep. So we've got basically the top part of this slide is the pre-COVID that we had talked about, which was an anticipated increase of about $141.59 this year and an estimated increase of about $100 next year. And then the post-COVID is at the bottom table. And this lays out the three different options, and the one that's highlighted that the governing body discussion sort of congealed around. And so the first option was to have the entire impact for COVID-19 in 2020. Second option was to do it all in 2021. Third option was to split it between the 2 years. And Mayor, I don't know if you want to comment on, I know you just sort of went through it, but how important it was for everybody to try and find a way to help ease the pain this year.
Absolutely. We understand that our neighbors and members of our community are incredibly impacted by the economic knock-on effects of COVID. And so it was clear that the governing body wanted to push as much of that tax burden to next year in order to relieve folks who are going to be directly impacted by the loss of their business, the loss of their job, um, to try and push that burden off. Unfortunately, it does mean that there will be a significant increase in taxes in 2021 unless changes are made at the federal and state level to some of the local aid that we discussed in the previous slide. This does mean that we have less time to recover between 2020 and 2021 before our significant and critical budget year in 2022. And so the next several years in Lambertville are going to be extremely difficult, which is why we have to all hunker down and have these tough conversations about what tax impact looks like and the ways in which the city can try and mitigate those tax impacts now for 2022.
So, the next step from our perspective here is, for May 5th, we will be bringing to the governing body a budget introduction that reflects this highlighted option here, and reflects all of the different points that we've discussed so far in this presentation. There's obviously a lot here. This definitely has gone on longer than each of us has intended, the presentation. But it's really important, especially with everything going on, that the community has access to all of the information about how we are coming to these numbers, how we're coming to the different options. We want you to be able to see the work, so that you have as much confidence in these numbers as we do, and that everybody sees the importance of some of the decisions that are in front of us. And so, Mayor, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add other than just encouraging people to check out the lambertvillenj.org /2020 budget page and to, come to the next council meeting.
Absolutely. And there's still options for us to continue to have these discussions publicly. The city of Lambertville has been working extremely diligently since since August of last year to provide as much budget information to not only the council, but to the public as possible. And so we are actually going to make this presentation as well as the potential slides for what the tax impact is going to look like, depending on various plans. And we're just going to keep on talking to the public about why we feel so strongly that the city's goal should be to mitigate tax impact as much as possible over the next 5 years. These are going to be tough conversations, but I'm really looking forward to having them with the community. All right. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.